Chronicles of the Past. Join us for the extraordinary story of a certain wall, whose construction divided one city into two parts. A wall that divided freedom from captivity and wealth from poverty. A better world was just a few meters away, a world that was often unreachable. This is a story of daring escapes, but also of victims of totalitarianism who lost their lives trying to reach the other side. Discover with us the history of the Berlin Wall, one of the greatest monuments and symbols of communism in the Cold War. But let's start from the beginning. The year is 1945, the end of World War II. Germany loses for the second time in a short period. The Allies come to the conclusion that to prevent history from repeating itself and to avoid another major war, this country should be divided into four occupation zones: the United States, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The same fate befell Berlin. This decision made Berlin one of the epicenters of the Cold War, as the city was literally divided into two parts, symbolizing the division of Europe into two opposing spheres of influence. Additionally, the entire city was surrounded by the Soviet zone. Consequently, West Berlin became an island of freedom and capitalism in a sea of communism. After the war, Germany was in poverty. This country, largely destroyed, experienced a huge economic crisis. Food was rationed, and money had no value. People often went hungry. The Americans, secretly from the Soviet Union, were preparing a reform to improve the economic situation in West Germany. As part of this reform, a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, was introduced, replacing the previous currency, the Reichsmark. This happened suddenly and surprised the unsuspecting Soviet Union. It was a move that unexpectedly and severely hit the interests of the Soviets. Angry Stalin responded very quickly. On June 24, 1948, just a few days after the reform was introduced, a blockade of West Berlin was imposed. It involved blocking all roads and railways leading to Berlin controlled by Western states. The city was cut off from supplies. The Soviet Union tried to exert pressure on America and force it to abandon the currency reform, as well as to stop the integration process of West Berlin with Western countries. Stalin hoped that the Americans would eventually withdraw, and the Soviet Union would take control of the entire Berlin. However, the United States was not willing to give up. They organized a huge and very costly operation called the Berlin Airlift, led by General Lucius D. Clay, who served as the commander of U.S. forces in Germany. In Berlin, planes delivering food, fuel, and even coal began to land every 4 minutes. Thousands of planes flew every day. It is worth mentioning that at that time, 2 million people lived in West Berlin. On average, about 5,000 tons of cargo were delivered daily. General Clay became a hero, and the Americans gained support in Berlin. The country, which not long ago during the war was an enemy and an occupier, now appeared as a savior. Protests against the policies of the Eastern Bloc also took place there. For the Soviet Union, this was a huge public relations disaster. Stalin finally gave up, and on May 12, 1949, the blockade was lifted. The Soviet Union will not make any more attempts to reunite Berlin. 11 days later, the United States, France, and Britain granted independence to the territories they occupied. Thus, the Federal Republic of Germany, abbreviated as FRG, was created, which became a capitalist country with a parliamentary democratic government. In response, on the territory occupied by the Soviet Union, on October 7th, the German Democratic Republic, abbreviated as GDR, a communist country where only one party governed, was established. In West Germany, the effects of the economic reform began to be visible quickly. The economy of the West was developing very rapidly, and people enjoyed freedom and civil liberties. This time was called the economic miracle. In the GDR, it looked completely different. The country was sinking into crisis, and citizens were monitored and controlled by the secret police. During this time, property and industry were nationalized, meaning they were taken over by the state. The media were subject to complete censorship. It was a time of total control, poverty, and lack of freedom of speech. Therefore, many people from the East decided to move to the West. In the first years when crossing the border was easy, hundreds of thousands of people left the GDR every year. In 1952, a meeting took place between the authorities of East Germany and Stalin in Moscow. At this meeting, the Soviets ordered the introduction of passes and the closing of the border, citing the need to stop the flow of agents from the West. In reality, it was about stopping the masses of escaping people. The year 1953 set a record for the number of people leaving the country, with as many as 250,000 people fleeing in the first 3 months alone. Those who didn't make it found the army and barbed wire waiting at the border. The border was closed, and crossing it became impossible. However, this situation did not apply to Berlin. Freedom of movement still prevailed in the city. In this way, the city became the only gateway to the West for the residents of East Germany. Berlin became the only place where borders could be crossed. This caused a huge influx of people from all over the country just to escape. The openness of Berlin also allowed residents to compare these two worlds, which were so close yet so different. In these comparisons, the communist part did not always come out on top. East German officials tried to implement controls, but it was completely ineffective. Why was such a situation allowed? Why weren't the borders closed there either? There are two reasons. The first is the internal railway line of the GDR, which ran through West Berlin. So closing the borders would have caused transport disruptions in the country. The second factor is the fear of the reaction from the United States. It took East Germany 10 years to build a new railway line bypassing West Berlin. During this time, crowds of people continued to leave the country constantly. Many young, ambitious, and educated people who saw no prospects in the communist state decided to flee. The country began to lack well-educated people and specialists. There was a shortage of doctors, engineers, teachers, lawyers, and other highly qualified individuals. This led to a situation where the country was paying for the education of young people who were leaving anyway, resulting in huge financial losses. By 1961, 3.5 million people had fled the country, which accounted for 25% of the entire population. There was a lack of people in the productive age group. The party unsuccessfully tried to counter the situation using propaganda. Radio and television spoke of escapees as traitors to the homeland, questioning the idea that life was better in the West. Propaganda leaflets were also distributed to people. As one might guess, these actions yielded no results. The East German government had long planned to build a wall to divide Berlin into two parts. In 1961, preparations began secretly. Materials were ordered from many construction companies to avoid suspicion. Walter Ulbricht, the first secretary of the party, when asked about any steps he planned to take regarding mass immigration, replied, "No one has any intention of erecting a wall dividing Berliners." He lied. Preparations for construction were already at an advanced stage. Despite attempts to maintain secrecy, the entire operation was discovered by American intelligence. From August 4th to 7, 1961, a secret meeting of the heads of state of France, England, West Germany, and the United States took place in Paris. Discussions were held on how to respond to the planned construction of the wall. Representatives of East Germany pressed for sanctions against the Eastern Bloc countries. The Americans preferred to settle the matter through diplomacy and peaceful actions. On August 12, 1961, Walter Ulbricht signed a document ordering the immediate closure of the border. At midnight, between August 12th and 13, all streetlights went out, and thousands of soldiers took to the streets surrounding West Berlin so that no one could sneak through. The construction began. Initially, the obstacle was only a fence with barbed wire. Roads located on the border were destroyed. Sunday, August 13th, would be called the Barbed Wire Sunday in Germany. Every effort was made to ensure that the barrier surrounding West Berlin ran on East German territory and did not encroach on West Berlin territory, as it was not wanted to provoke demolition actions in the future. The party justified the construction of the wall as a defense against Western spies. They called the wall an anti-fascist defense. Everything was to protect the residents of East Berlin, except for some reason, the guard positions were turned towards their own citizens. In the first days, when the fortifications were not yet difficult to overcome, many people, feeling that it might be their last chance, decided to escape. Many among those designated to set up fortifications also decided to escape. One of these people was Konrad Schumann, a soldier of the People's Army. While performing his duties on the border, he suddenly turned around and fled, jumping over the barbed wire. His jump was captured in a photo that quickly spread around the world and became a symbol of the Cold War and oppression. Initially, buildings on the border also served as great places to escape. It happened that a building located in the eastern part had windows facing the other western side. However, people living on the lower floors were quickly evicted, and their windows were bricked up. One of the people fleeing from such a building was Frieda Schulze, a 77-year-old woman who decided to jump from the first-floor apartment window. First, she threw out some of her valuables and then her cat, and slowly went out the window, standing on the ledge on the outside of the building. A crowd of people gathered under the building, ready to catch the elderly woman. Suddenly, several hands appeared from the windows and grabbed the woman, trying to pull her back in. It was the border guards who noticed the situation and rushed to stop the woman from escaping. Seeing this, people from the west climbed the wall and, grabbing her legs, pulled the old woman down. The residents of West Berlin won the tug of war, and the woman flew down, fortunately caught by the people gathered there. However, not every story had a happy ending. Jetta Seckman was a woman who, on November 22, 1961, jumped from the third floor of a building on Bernauer Strasse. Unfortunately, she was seriously injured and died as a result of her injuries. Soon, all people were evicted from buildings located on the border, and the buildings were destroyed. The construction of the wall divided many families, friends, and couples. The wall was the cause of many human tragedies. The possibility of making phone calls was blocked. Sad situations began to occur on the streets of Berlin. Young parents stood on ladders to show their newborn grandchildren to their grandparents over the wall. There are known cases of weddings held next to the wall so that the family could participate in the ceremony by observing it from the windows of tall buildings. People tried to communicate from the windows of tall buildings, but soon this became illegal and punishable. Right after the construction of the wall began, the mayor of West Berlin sent a demand to the President of the United States for immediate intervention. Kennedy responded, "The wall is definitely better than war." The fortifications at the border gradually transformed into the familiar wall we see in photographs. Some drivers chose to ram the fortifications at high speeds as a means of escape, so ditches were dug in front of the wall to prevent vehicle entry. Additional fences, dog runs, and minefields were added. A death strip, devoid of any cover to evade guards' gunfire, was also established, and the wall was painted white to aid guards in aiming. Eventually, the wall took the form of a 3-meter-high concrete barrier, topped with a metal pipe to hinder climbing. From the western side, the wall was unguarded, so graffiti and slogans calling for freedom began to appear. There were several American border crossings designated for military personnel and government officials, such as diplomats, in accordance with the Potsdam Conference agreements. One of these crossings was the well-known Checkpoint Charlie, the site of a potential trigger for World War III. The situation that unfolded here is considered one of the tensest points of the Cold War. On October 22, 1961, just 2 months after the Berlin Wall was built, the chief of the American mission, along with his wife, attempted to go to the theater in the eastern part of the city. Their vehicle was marked as belonging to the diplomatic corps. According to the Potsdam Conference agreements, no German had the right to demand their documents to check their identity. However, at the border, they were stopped by a border guard and asked for such documents. Outraged, the official demanded the presence of a Soviet soldier to verify his identity, as only they had the right to do so. No such soldier appeared. Upon learning of the situation, General Lucius D. Clay, who had led the Berlin airlift operation, was furious. He dispatched an armed gendarmerie unit of 8 to escort the official to the theater and back. Additionally, 4 American tanks were placed near Checkpoint Charlie. The Soviets took no action. The Americans were outraged, claiming that the Soviet command was ignoring the situation. They demanded immediate action to cease inspections of vehicles belonging to Western diplomatic missions. The East Berlin commandant deemed the dispatching of an armed gendarmerie unit and tank placement a provocation, emphasizing that verifying individuals at the border was entirely justified. He also warned the Americans against further provoking the Soviets. The next day, the East German government officially announced via radio that non-uniformed personnel from Western countries crossing the checkpoints were subject to identity document checks. This was a test of strength and an attempt to strip Americans of some of their rights. General Clay was not going to back down. In the following days, he deliberately sent additional marked cars. East German border guards attempted to stop and inspect them. 6 additional American tanks, this time equipped with dozer blades, were sent to the border. The Soviets finally decided to react. 33 Soviet tanks were sent to Berlin. These tanks positioned themselves 50 to 100 meters from checkpoint Charlie. The Americans positioned their tanks at the same distance. Additionally, infantry took positions on 3 armored personnel carriers. From 5:27 p.m. on October 27, 1961, for 18 hours, American and Soviet tanks faced each other, armed with live ammunition. Crowds gathered on both sides of the wall. Interestingly, Americans deliberately crossed checkpoint Charlie to see if their rights would also be violated in this case. The alert level was raised in the American garrison in Berlin, in NATO armies, and finally in the Strategic Air Command in the United States. Clay was certain that demolishing parts of the walls would result in a better position for America and its allies in future negotiations, without eliciting a Soviet response. On October 28th, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk informed General Clay that Berlin was not a vital interest of the United States that would justify the use of force. Later that day, Khrushchev and Kennedy reached an agreement. The American president pledged that if the Soviet side withdrew its tanks, they would do the same. At 11 a.m., the first Soviet tank withdrew 5 meters backward, and in response, one of the American tanks did the same. Tank by tank, they slowly retreated. General Clay's actions were negatively evaluated, and he was soon recalled to America. After this situation, the Soviet authorities did not allow East Germans to take actions contrary to the decisions of the Potsdam Conference. Interestingly, during the crisis, American units deployed non-deployable nuclear artillery pieces. They were among the smallest in the arsenal for delivering nuclear payloads. 2 years later, the Americans themselves abandoned this type of weapon, as there was a risk that an irresponsible individual with access to them could start a nuclear war. This successfully avoided armed conflict resolution, and the world happily avoided World War III. The construction of the wall greatly reduced the number of emigrating people. Additionally, it solved problems with the coexistence of 2 currencies in the capital and resolved the issue of the gray area of trade between states. The economy of East Germany definitely benefited. However, the wall itself was a huge PR disaster for the Eastern Bloc. Western countries portrayed it as a symbol of repression and enslavement. These voices became particularly strong when the first victims were shot by guards during attempts to cross the border. The first person shot was 24-year-old Günter Litvin. He was shot by a border guard on August 24, 1961, while attempting to swim across the River Spree. During the existence of the wall, between 130 and even 200 people were killed. Sources disagree on this matter. Guards were ordered to shoot escapees, even in the presence of women and children. It happened that wounded escapees were not given help. They were allowed to bleed out, lying in the death strip. A well-known example of such a situation is the shooting of Peter Fechter, who was shot by East German border guards while attempting to escape on August 17, 1962. Fechter tried to jump over the Berlin Wall near checkpoint Charlie, but was shot by guards. After being shot, Fechter fell into the zone between the walls, where he lay wounded for about an hour before being taken by East German officials. Despite being in sight and audible to witnesses in the West, He did not receive medical help and died from bleeding. His tragic death became a symbol of the brutality of the Berlin Wall and the oppression of the communist regime. Photographs of his agony were captured by photojournalists and circulated worldwide, becoming an icon of the cruelty of the Berlin Wall. Crossing the border became really difficult and dangerous. However, there was no shortage of brave people. People escaped in various ways. 70 tunnels were dug, and the sewer system was used because it was established before the division of Berlin. People built homemade hot air balloons or gliders. One of the escapees was 19-year-old Heinz Meixner. Meixner worked as a mechanic in the East German People's Army, where he had access to military equipment. He decided to use his position to escape. He stole a specially armored delivery van, which was reinforced at the front to withstand impacts. He managed to cross the border despite attempts to stop him by soldiers. His action was unprecedented and extremely risky, but it ended successfully. Heinz Meixner was recognized as one of the most spectacular escapees from East Berlin. Another interesting story is the story of digging a tunnel later named Tunnel 29. This tunnel is unique because it was the only one dug from the western part to the eastern part. Did a West Berliner want to start a new life on the eastern side of Germany? Nothing could be further from the truth. Digging this tunnel was a rescue mission organized by a group of students, which allowed 29 people to escape. The tunnel was 145 meters long. During the existence of the wall, 100,000 people attempted to escape, of which 5,000 succeeded. What about legal travel? Who could cross the borders and under what conditions? In the first years after the wall was built, citizens could not cross the border. Over the years, however, the regulations were relaxed. Citizens of West Germany and other Western countries were allowed to visit East Germany after obtaining the appropriate visas. Residents of West Berlin were forced in such cases to exchange their currency for marks at a very unfavorable rate. They could visit family on holidays and important occasions. East German citizens had more trouble leaving the country. Only those who had to travel professionally could leave the country. It also happened that someone was granted permission to leave for important family matters, such as funerals. In each of these cases, the citizen had to submit an individual application, which never guaranteed a positive outcome. It could be rejected without giving a reason. Even if permission was granted, those leaving the country could exchange very little money so as not to give the opportunity to sell their property for a new life on the western side. In 1972, an 8-year-old boy of Turkish descent, Cengiz Katranci, who was playing with a friend in West Berlin, fell into the river Spree. Despite pleas for help from people on the riverbank, no one reacted because witnesses feared crossing the border. The boy died, drowning in front of the watching people. This tragic event sparked a wide-ranging discussion about child safety and the situation at the border. As a result of negotiations after the boy's death, an agreement was reached on rescue operations at the border of both states. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Unlike his predecessors, he pursued a policy increasing the freedoms and rights of citizens. He made efforts to improve relations with Western countries and to end the Cold War. He focused on reforms and changes aimed at rebuilding the Soviet economy. The laws proposed by him brought the Soviet Union closer to the democratic countries of the West. The rule of Gorbachev meant an increase in freedom for the countries dependent on the Soviet Union. These countries were slowly liberalizing, and tyranny and oppression were gradually fading away. In countries like Poland and East Germany, opposition was gaining strength. People felt that the totalitarian communist regimes were on the brink of collapse. On June 12, 1987, in West Berlin, a speech by the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, took place. The speech was delivered in front of the Brandenburg Gate and was listened to by over 200,000 people. The emotions stirred by the speech were immense, both among the residents of West Berlin and around the world, as it represented a clear condemnation of the communist regime and an appeal for freedom for all people. Reagan said, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, If you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Peaceful demonstrations were taking place in East Germany. Initially, they were suppressed. However, the sentiments were clear. People wanted freedom. People wanted the destruction of this cursed wall. Another significant event that strengthened the spirit of resistance among Berliners was a concert organized to mark the 750th anniversary of the founding of Berlin. The concert took place at the Neues Königliches Opernhaus Square in the center of West Berlin. It was a symbolic event aimed at emphasizing the unity between the two parts of Berlin, West and East. David Bowie was one of the many artists who performed at this concert, which was one of the greatest cultural events in Berlin's history. Seeing the mood of the people, the authorities in East Germany decided to take steps to ease tensions. A major concert featuring a well-known Western star was organized. Bruce Springsteen was invited to the country, and his performance was broadcast on television, with over 300,000 people attending in person. It was an event that the entire East Berlin lived through. People were having a great time. At one point, Springsteen spoke in German, saying, "I'm neither for nor against the government. I came here to play rock and roll in the hope that one day all barriers will be removed." People were euphoric, and anti-communist sentiments only grew stronger. Discontent and rebellion primarily affected young people. The entire young generation was against the country's politics. Demonstrations intensified, and the residents of the East had had enough. On June 4th, 1989, in the neighboring country of East Germany, Poland, communism fell. The first free elections were held there. These elections were groundbreaking because for the first time since the end of World War II, democratic opposition was allowed to participate. The fall of communism in Poland inspired the opposition in East Germany, which also sought freedom and democracy. The successes of the opposition in Poland and their ability to peacefully transform the political system became a source of hope for the citizens of East Germany and inspired them to act. It was also a very strong blow to the entire Eastern Bloc. These events opened up a new path for the citizens of East Germany to escape from the country. People were fleeing en masse to the east to Poland, where they went to the embassy seeking political asylum. A similar situation was happening in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. On October 6th and 7th, grand celebrations were organized for the 40th anniversary of the GDR, with even Gorbachev flying to Germany to participate. At the same time, in Leipzig and Berlin, clashes with the police occurred during protests. The situation was getting out of hand for the ruling government in the country. Politicians were planning to declare martial law and imprison thousands of opposition members. The crisis was attempted to be overcome by forceful methods. Numerous incidents occurred, including the brutal suppression of demonstrations by security forces and attempts to intimidate the opposition. Seeing that forceful methods were not yielding the desired results and that the opposition was only growing stronger, the East German government decided to change tactics. It was recognized that the current chairman of the State Council, Erich Honecker, was not handling the situation in the country well. He was therefore disciplined and relieved of his duties. Egon Krenz was appointed in his place, who adopted a strategy aimed at easing tensions. The opposition ceased to be treated from a position of strength. The party began talks with the opposition, promising a relaxation of the state's policy. Negotiations were held for amnesty for arrested opposition members, greater freedom of travel, and even initiating proceedings and punishing officials who exceeded their powers during the suppression of protests. On June 4th, 1989, the first free demonstration took place, with 1 million people participating. They demanded freedom of speech, freedom of travel, and free elections. The party yielded and decided to introduce a new plan for departures and emigration from East Germany. On November 9, 1989, a press conference was held. Günter Schabowski, a member of the political bureau of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, participated in it. He was designated to inform citizens about the decisions of the party regarding the new travel law. Due to astonishing incompetence, Schabowski was not prepared. He was only given a handwritten note that he didn't even read before the appearance. As a result, he made a mistake that would forever change the face of Berlin and all of Germany. During the conference, Schabowski misinterpreted the information and gave the wrong answer to a journalist's question. He announced that every citizen would receive permission to cross the border. When asked when the law would come into effect, he replied, "According to my information, immediately." One of the journalists asked if this also applied to West Berlin. He confirmed. This mistake forever altered the course of history. The message that reached the listeners was, the border has been opened. Thousands of Berlin residents headed towards border crossings. Initially, confused border guards tried to stop the crowd. They had not been informed in advance about the new law or the plan to open the borders. Finally, at 9:20 p.m., yielding to the demands of the people, the first border crossing was opened. 10 minutes later, the first radio broadcasts reported on the open border crossings. Even more people headed towards the wall. No one could stop the crowds anymore. Joy and euphoria reigned in the streets. That evening, the Parliament of West Germany interrupted its session, and the German anthem was sung. Following Berlin's example, the borders across the country opened during the night. The next day, the pressure of people was even greater. The residents of West Germany warmly welcomed their eastern neighbors. People from the east and the west celebrated together, with pubs near the wall spontaneously offering free beer. Cars honked, and strangers embraced each other. Many of the gathered climbed the wall to celebrate the end of years of oppression. Many Berliners spent the following days demolishing the wall. They punched holes in it, chipped away pieces of concrete, creating many unofficial border crossings by making breaches in the wall. Initially, the guards attempted to repair the wall's damage, but it quickly became apparent that they couldn't keep up and eventually gave up. The guards were lenient towards the Berliners destroying the wall and didn't take any action against them. Additional official border crossings were opened. Bulldozers destroyed the wall in places where streets once ran, connecting east and west, reconnecting them. 2 days before Christmas Eve, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl crossed through the wall, where he was greeted by Hans Madrau, the last communist premier of the German Democratic Republic. They discussed the future of both countries and the potential reunification of Germany. On New Year's Eve, a concert was held by the famous American actor and singer David Hasselhoff, known, among other things, for Baywatch. The concert took place near the Brandenburg Gate, right by the wall. David stood on a platform that was raised so he could be seen on both sides of the wall. People gathered on both sides of the wall, and many sat on it. Around 1 million people attended the event. People of all ages. Berliners celebrated the end of divisions. Hasselhoff's concert had significant symbolic meaning, as it took place shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and was perceived as an expression of solidarity and joy associated with the reunification of Germany. His presence and performance became iconic symbols of that period in history and a demonstration of how music and culture can play a role in breaking down barriers. Looking for Freedom became the unofficial anthem of German reunification. On June 13, 1990, the final dismantling of the wall began. The demolition lasted until December. According to estimates, over 2 million tons of debris were removed from the wall. A few months later, on October 3rd, after lengthy negotiations, Germany was reunited. The communist government of East Germany collapsed forever. Shortly afterward, Chris Geffroy's mother went to the prosecutor's office. Chris was the last person shot dead while attempting to cross the wall. On February 6, 1989, along with his friend Christian Gaudian, Chris Geffroy decided to escape across the Berlin border. They chose what they believed to be a weaker link in the border barrier. They began crossing the Havel River, which form a part of the border between East and West Berlin. After crossing the river, they started running toward the western side of Berlin. However, they were spotted by border guards. The guards opened fire to stop the escapees. As a result of the shooting, Christian Gaudian was injured, but managed to reach the western side of Berlin. Unfortunately, Chris Geoffroy was shot and fell on the eastern side of the border. Despite attempts by West German guards to help him, he died on the spot. The guards responsible for his death were honored and even received a small cash bonus. Chris's mother demanded justice and filed a criminal complaint. This led to the first trial of wall guards, with many more to come in the future. Based on the evidence gathered and the findings of the investigation, the guards involved in shooting Chris Geoffroy were charged with a crime. Their defense was that they were just following orders and did not intend to kill. The sentences handed down were surprisingly lenient. Several guards received suspended sentences, and those directly responsible for Chris's death received up to 2 years in prison. The low sentences were argued on the grounds that the guards were the lowest-ranking perpetrators among the East German oppressors. This set a precedent, leading to subsequent trials of guards, also resulting in exceptionally light sentences. Out of the 80 guards who stood trial, 70 received suspended sentences. 6 members of the National Security Council, who held political responsibility, also stood trial. They were charged with at least 68 murders. Erich Honecker, the de facto head of state, escaped criminal responsibility due to illness. He died in 1994. Today, there is little of the wall left to see. After its fall in 1989, most of the wall structures were dismantled or destroyed. However, certain fragments have been preserved as historical monuments and places of remembrance. The longest remaining stretch of the wall is the East Side Gallery, which has been turned into an open-air art gallery by artists. Checkpoint Charlie is also accessible to visitors, where there is now a replica border crossing, an information point for tourists, and a small museum dedicated to the history of this symbolic checkpoint. Nearby, you can also see fragments of original signs and guard barracks, although most of the infrastructure was dismantled after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This concludes the fascinating history of the Berlin Wall. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you're interested in history and would like to hear more amazing stories, subscribe to our channel. See you later.